Hello, Nina. Here we are again, alive and
Hello and
kicking.
welcome to the most popular show, which is probably why YouTube didn't like us. Apologies for a slight delay. We had to restart a whole bunch of things technically, but luck would have it, we have a tech genius participating in this project. It's his project, in fact. So,
You should stop calling me that. That's bad luck.
oh, is
That's
this
why things are
am I
not
jinxing
working.
you? Oh, Marcelo, he's terrible at technology. He just
Yeah.
doesn't know what he's doing. But anyways,
Let-
yes,
let-
apologies for a slight delay. It's because we had to basically restart a bunch of things that were happening on the back end with YouTube because we're so popular, obviously.
yeah, that's what I always say. The CIA is taking a look on us.
Probably multiple agencies
Yeah.
from various countries. But we're going to talk about the case of Navalny, which has obviously been in the news since last week. And my question would be to you, Marcelo. You're sort of an outsider looking in. You are, living in the environment of Western mainstream media, and your information mostly comes from that media, and of course, Brazilian media. But I'm just kind of curious, as an outsider looking in, what has your impression been about? I don't know how much you know about this so-called opposition politician who died last week under sketchy circumstances in a prison where he was serving a sentence for various crimes, some of them linked to corruption. But obviously, the type of Western media coverage we're receiving and reality may or may not be two very, very different things. So I'm just curious, before we get into it, what your impression is as sort of like an outsider.
Well, okay. So I'm going to start with a bit of background. Until I would say maybe 3-4 months ago, I had no idea who Navalny was. I have never heard about the guy.
You're probably in the same boat as many other people, much like people haven't heard of what Ukraine is. We're now in a
Exactly.
situation, unless they really have been plugged into the news, and then they're sort of like political junkies,
Exactly.
not on your radar. Okay, so what have you learned?
So, what have I learned? Well, I cannot tell from mainstream media because I'm not a mainstream media guy that much. So yeah, what I look around is the usual things, Twitter and some secondary channels or some not mainstream channels. So the case for me was very clear that the guy was a tool for the West, and in an attempt for color revolution at a certain period of time, and also that he was completely irrelevant for Russia itself. So that's what I learned recently. That's because I searched about the subject. That's most of people don't do. People watch
But if
CNN,
people
people
go
watch
on
New York Times.
Wikipedia, much like we were discussing just before we launched
Exactly.
this episode, it's much different. Now, I didn't even dare to go into the English-speaking Wikipedia because we kind of know what it's going to be like. Have you dared to do that?
So no, yeah, of course,
Of
I
course.
looked there, and so the first thing. So I will give you another perspective, which is my friends. The WhatsApp groups of friends of older times, school and stuff like that. First thing was that all the news that Navalny had died and Putin did it and all that stuff. And people are like, yeah, that's how it's done in Russia, And well, so that kinds of gives you a temperature of I will not say even average people, because that's I'm talking about very smart people that I know, but still
But I mean, they
the
might be
main
smart in a certain, like they might be very intelligent scientists or engineers, but they may be kind of naive about foreign policy, international relations, propaganda, those types of things, right? People can be sort of have a high intelligence level according to certain parameters, and be completely just ignorant or naive, for the lack of a better word, in other situations, which I certainly have family members like that, so I know people like that socially as well, so I think that's relevant.
That's exactly the point. One thing that I always say here on our channel, the IDM, is that, people have work to do, children to take care of, family,
Exactly.
fun, and you don't have time. You don't have time to search for things. So where do you go? You go to the mainstream newspapers that,
Well, you have your
kind of
pop-up,
helps.
right? Your news sort of aggregate on your phone, right? That pops up and it shows you an overview for that
Exactly.
day. At least in US and
Exactly.
Canada, that's what you get. And it's giving you all the selected headlines and little blurbs. And yes, people who are very busy, which most of us are, that's kind of what they're getting. So, unless you really have that deeper interest in a particular subject, and even then, that doesn't make you immune from sort of extreme levels of propaganda. But, that was kind of my attempt. This is why I went on the Russian language Wikipedia to sort of gauge the atmosphere. And of course, we know Wikipedia is obviously hasn't been an objective source of information and has been selectively edited, and this has all been discussed by other people. So I think people who would be watching this would be aware of this. But I was just kind of amazed. The Russian language Wikipedia was just dominated by citation to mainstream Western media, but it was all in English. All the citation that I was looking, I mean, it's a huge page, so I haven't checked every single footnote. But the ones I was clicking on was, New York Times in English. So, like, what is the expectation here? A Russian who is casually perusing Wikipedia is going to go and have perfect English to read these sources. It was dominated by, quotes from Zelensky. It was just absolutely outrageous. I mean, just my perception, again, I haven't looked at the whole thing, was that there were more English language sources than Russian language sources. And then the Russian language sources were very selective too. There was one sort of quasi-opposition paper that they kept referring to because it always portrayed Navalny in a very positive light over the long term. So of course there was not anything to challenge it there, even for as like, how sometimes Wikipedia has criticism for figures from the past. And then there's, sometimes modern figures too. And then there's sort of a little bit of information. Well, these pundits say this, but these other pundits disagree with them. And it was really kind of crazy. And then, of course, the other major Russian language source was Medusa, which is, funded by the ex-oligarch Khodorkovsky, and it's run out of the Baltic or somewhere else in Europe these days. So it was very, very selective. I mean, again, from what I've seen, I haven't seen every single source. It was definitely not only trying to create a particular perception, but the fact that it kept linking to English language sources just kind of blew my mind. It wasn't even like translations of these sources that do exist, pretty frequently on major Russian websites. So there was definitely, and again, it's not like Russians would go to Wikipedia as their first source of information, but there's definitely that attempt. And it might also be targeting the Russian diaspora, right, living abroad, that may be reading this in English, but they may be living somewhere else as well, and this is what they would be accessing. And the level of skewed was just beyond the usual Wikipedia with all this English language citation, and of course it's just been very recently updated, right? If it's introducing very recent quotes in the last week, right, by various politicians. And the other thing that this article was doing, it would make these very generic statements about the quote unquote political persecution of Navalny, and it would talk about multiple politicians and pundits have concluded. And then you click on the link and it's like one guy, and it would be some uber Russophobic politician somewhere, or it would be one of those Russian liberals that now live in the West, like, the former chess player Kasparov, which is, in my opinion, he's kind of a clown. And that would be the source for many politicians and pundits. It would be like one guy, maybe two guys. So it was really just kind of outrageous. And obviously most people are not going to go through this little, not quite a deep dive, but a little bit, more of an investigation of the sources than usual. But I definitely would not expect so many English language sources on a Russian language Wikipedia. And then when you go deeper into the specific articles, because it's a huge article, that are also in Wikipedia, those are more balanced. So as
Yeah.
soon as you start going deeper, so the expectation here is the initial, like most people are not going to go through all the articles. They're going to read the one page, right? And so the expectation is like, this is what they're going to read. This is the thing that has to impact them the most. But the other ones are sort of like semi-okay. At least there is a little bit of a more balanced source base for those articles. So it was just amazing to me, even though I know all the stuff already, so.
Yeah, no, exactly. And this is very interesting because when we started the project here, me and Davidson, we were talking a lot about this thing. And, one of I'll give you an example of our side here, Davidson, who is someone that is not an average person when it comes to geopolitics. It's someone that actually goes around and search stuff.
And you should mention that he does reside in Brazil, right? That you're in Europe,
Yeah,
but he
exactly.
does live. So it is kind of international in that sense.
Exactly, but in any case, he's not someone that's going to live by the mainstream media. So he's going always to search on separate sources. Plus, he has some knowledge of history. So I'll give you an example. That's not Navalny itself, but which was the Russia Gates. When we were discussing about the Russia Gates, his position was that. How can I say? So what he was thinking was that, okay, two can play this game. You understand what I mean? So the Putin was actually putting his finger on the American election, and then years later we find out that and he had a very interesting, he had disclosed a very interesting theory, aluminum foil hat about that, but perfect actually. And at some point, I just came to him and said, look, that theory is fantastic and it works perfectly, but you have to assume that the Russia Gates happened.
Yes, exactly. There has to be a base assumption.
The base assumption should be that it actually happened. So all that, it's okay, but that needed to happen. And now we know
that it's been debunked.
It's been debunked. I would not say that. I would not assume that Russia or China or whoever, they are not playing their game as well. Right. But we understood now that was all a thing by the Democrats and Hillary and all those guys. So when it comes to Navalny, it is not different. People like him, we're going to say, the Putin put his hand there. Well, right. Why he should?
Yes.
Why he should.
And, we talked about as sort of, right, the general introduction, right? This is a supposed oppositionist who has never gained more than around 2%. I mean, it might be a little bit higher in sort of the broad scale Russian landscape. There was one case where Navalny did do well, and that was the municipal election in Moscow, right, in 2013. He actually did do well. He gained just over a quarter of the votes, which is, that's impressive. Let's give him credit where credit is due. But at the same time, we have to consider that Moscow in some ways is representative of Russia and in other ways it's not, right? It's kind of a complex question. We just had this debate on X a few weeks ago, whether capital cities and metropolitan areas, to the extent to which they represent the periphery. But definitely the demographic there that would vote for someone like Navalny would be sort of younger people. It's not going to be, pensioners and so on and so forth. So, but yeah, let's give him where credit is due. But as far as sort of the broad landscape, this was not a serious politician that could challenge any of the, let's say, sitting party members in, United Russia or something like that for all of Russia. So some of the statistics that I think we've seen are sort of around 2%, maybe around a little bit higher. So that's not a serious, someone who could seriously really challenge sort of the dominant political forces in Russia. So then we can sort of go back to the 2018 election, and we discussed this elsewhere, where just a month before, not even a month, it was weeks before that election in the spring of 2018 in Russia, in which, of course, Putin was running too, there was that so-called poisoning of the Skripal family, right, in London. and no one has seen him since. There was all this hoopla and all this, Putin used this battle agent or whatever chemical, Novichok, and they gave it this really ridiculous name, right? Novichok meaning like someone who is new, but it sounds very kind of like Soviet spy movie type thing that would definitely feed into the Cold War narratives that have never fully gone away, and again, and of course that sort of dampened the tone of the election, because there was all this, negative publicity, of course, expectedly in the Western media echo chamber. No, I'm just like, which language am I speaking now? Echo chamber, yes. Ecosystem, but echo chamber, yes, in the Western media echo chamber. And of course, we haven't heard from the Skripal family since. So no one's really been able to interview them. And it's just kind of like, that's really curious. And at the same time now, right, the Russian election is coming up in March. So again, it's just about a month prior to this big election. It's in the middle of this major geopolitical change. It's in the middle of the Ukraine war. Now, obviously, there is also a war happening in the Middle East that is major. But in terms of what impacts Russia more directly, it's the Ukrainian situation, because Russia is the direct participant. And all of a sudden, we have the so-called opposition leader. At least this is what has been lauded as in the Western media for years. He dies under, sketchy circumstances. Now, again, we could put on our tinfoil hats in a moment, but if you kind of think about Putin's popularity has been high in both cases, and he's sort of riding this wave of popularity. And in each case, just a month before the election, he just decides, I'm just going to ruin it for myself. I'm going to press the button, and I'm going to have these guys killed. And it doesn't matter whether they're half the world away, right, across the ocean in London, or in Russia. He's gonna do it. So it's like, if you're abroad, you can be killed by Putin. If you're in Russia, you can be killed by Putin. So basically, much like we said earlier, like just let me die in peace. But it doesn't really make sense logically in that sense. Even before we get into any kind of tinfoil hat figures of who would benefit from this situation. So. Yeah, it's just kind of remarkable. The timing is remarkable.
Yeah, what I think is very interesting is that, as you said, the Putin has his hand on Moscow or all Russia, and then in London, and then in the United States election, and
in Hungary and in France.
I think it's time for panicking, because Russia just dominate the planet. Why are you guys trying to fight for the Putin can do everything anywhere?
He can just send psychic messages.
Yeah, exactly. Soon enough, he'll be doing that. Someone will say that he's controlling the fragile Biden's brain or whatever. And it's very interesting that this Navalny case, but let's try to
go back. We'll pull another Putin. We'll go back.
Yeah, let's go back a little bit on time from the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that's one point that we discussed several times here in the channel, not only with you but with other people from other parts of the planet as well. And when you wrote me when we were discussing this idea about this show, you wrote this point of the USSR collapse and the vacuum, the ideological vacuum. And that is it's a fertile soil for crazy people starting to rise from nowhere. So can you please explain me a little bit about this
so
moment?
The reason why we talked about going back to the 90s and the 2000s in the first place is because we know that Navalny has also been linked to these kind of really extreme nationalist type movements that existed in Russia, right? There are these videos and statements of him circulating, going to the so-called Russian March, and that's kind of a nationalist event. And I would kind of, in my perception of it, it's kind of like a dog breakfast of ideologies, because you would have people who are sort of anti-Soviet monarchists, but at the same time...
Just a second, I have your video is very bad. I'm going just to restart your camera. Okay, it seems better, I guess.
I guess that doesn't sound very promising.
Yeah, but it's much better, in fact.
Okay, perfect. So,
Okay.
there's this discrepancy between people that are sort of plugged into politics and they're looking at information that is below the surface of the MSM, right? And so they, obviously Russians know this, but these Westerners found videos of Navalny comparing supposedly right Muslims to cockroaches and just really kind of by Western standards really extreme stuff. And so he would attend the so-called Russian March. Like I said, it's kind of a dog breakfast of ideologies in my perception. Some people may disagree. So you would have anti-Soviet monarchists, you would have more of these kind of nationalists, some people call them Nazis. You kind of have all these different elements at this one event. And his call was at this time, he kind of tuned into things that some people, kind of this, maybe not every Russian, but some Russians would say a slogan, "Stop feeding the Caucasus." And that had to do with the amount of money that was going to, sort of in the context of the two Chechen wars that were going on at the time, fighting terrorism, et cetera, et cetera. So this is why, because there's this undercurrent that does exist in the Western narrative. I mean, you can jump on some Western media and you can find it, maybe on like The Salon or something, not maybe in the New York Times, but it's definitely there. And so we kind of wanted to examine that a little bit too, before we can talk about Navalny's other actions. And to understand that, we have to go back to the 90s, right? So we talked about the dissolution of the Soviet Union by now a few times, because it's sort of this pivotal moment that frames a lot of things that are happening right now. It's been called this peaceful revolution, right? Peaceful change of one government to another, but of course it was nothing but peaceful. We're still seeing the aftermath right now, right, in the case of Ukraine, and that's how many years later, right? That's 30 years later. And there was all this other stuff that has been generally ignored because that narrative has really been whitewashed, because the importation of neoliberalism into Russia that caused tremendous socioeconomic suffering, right? That's really not discussed much by mainstream pundits in the official West. So basically, you have this economic collapse, not just in Russia, but also in sort of the former Soviet republics to various extents. People are struggling to survive. There's this huge brain drain, right? This is when my family leaves. There's other types of immigration as well. And against this backdrop, of course, there is now this ideological vacuum. And so when people are struggling to survive, including the government, and trying to implement these insane neoliberal policies, they're less concerned about explicit ideology. And of course, when you have this vacuum, something has to come in. And this is interesting in two ways. Now, first of all, when the Soviet system collapsed, in my opinion, the pendulum swung way far in the other direction. I think it's understandable that people really were questioning the entire Soviet experience. Some of them had very negative perceptions of it. No doubt the negative perceptions were colored by the economic hardship that they were going through. So that's sort of one part of it. You had this rise of people that were entirely rejecting the 70-something years of the Soviet Union. Instead of looking at it in a more balanced way, well, this is, we had Imperial Russia, which had positive and negative features. We had the Soviet Union, which had different positive and negative features, and now we have post-Soviet Russia, right? It was really not balanced at all. Some people still have this opinion, but they're in the minority. So this is when you have... Mhm. So, okay, I'll give you a moment.
Go ahead, please.
Okay. So this is basically right the ideological environment. You had people who became monarchists, who wanted to just go back to at least the ideology of the late Russian Empire, and to resurrect it in a certain way. They viewed it in an excessively positive way while disregarding the negatives. You had these sort of more extreme nationalists that wanted to focus on like the ethno-nationalist features of the Russian ethnicity, which of course is difficult and very problematic, right, in a multicultural country that has approximately 190 different ethnicities, right? It's a problem for many reasons. And you also had remember the Soviet Union was officially an atheist state and it was very secular, which didn't mean that religion went away, right? We talked about the existence of orthodoxy, right? Quasi-officially, especially since Stalin sanctioned it since World War II. And of course, you had these parts of the Soviet Union that were Muslim, but they were definitely, practicing their religion sort of in a kind of rural settings, but not in a secular officially atheist state to the same extent that you would in a state that doesn't have that type of ideology. So all of that stuff started to come back, and you would say, well, isn't that great that there is this resurgence of older traditions? Okay, I think I lost you. Let me know if you're back, because I can only see my. Oh, I can see you again. Perfect. No worries. Technology is amazing.
Yeah. I'm still fighting with the quality of the camera, but it's okay. The important is the content. We are slowly learning here.
No worries. We're in different parts of the world as well, so I think that's understandable. But basically, on the surface, you say, well, isn't that great that people are rediscovering their religious traditions and embracing them once again? But the problem was that there was this importation of extremist ideologies like Wahhabism and Salafism to various parts of republics that were no longer part of the Soviet Union, right, in Central Asia, but also in the North Caucasus that remained part of the Russian Federation, right? So this was a big problem. So, now that I've sort of gone back and reacquainted myself with that period, right? So the 90s to about 2009, so the period of the two Chechen wars, it's really kind of remarkable the extent to which it reminds me of the Syrian situation, even more so than I kind of perceived it before. Now, of course, the war in Syria didn't come out of social collapse like it's, like the post-Soviet situation with the Chechen wars did, but this importation of militants from multiple countries is kind of a very interesting parallel to the Syrian situations that you had. You did have some Chechens, of course, right? Because Chechnya was sort of the focal point, plus some of the other northern Caucasus republics like Dagestan, right? But when you start kind of looking at the numbers that I didn't realize that. I kind of always thought of it as the second Chechen war being more dominated by foreign militants, kind of in important positions of power. But the first Chechen war was too. This is under Yeltsin. And I was looking at the numbers. I think the official statistic was more than 1,000 sort of major militants. I was looking at their citizenship. It was like Turkey, Saudi Arabia, et cetera, Afghanistan. So it was just like this huge list, which was really very, very, very telling in terms of how the Western media really portrayed it as these freedom fighters, right? Rebelling against Russia and rediscovering themselves. But in reality, there was this really important foreign element that was coming into play. It was people who were not even born in Chechnya, right? Coming there specifically to fight. And they were importing this really, well, I would say a set of extremist ideologies, right? So that's kind of another thing that filled the vacuum in certain parts of the Russian Federation. And the Chechen wars, I don't want to go too much into this. It's a complex topic, but basically you kind of had the latter part of the 90s, right, with Yeltsin embroiled in the first Chechen war. And the interesting thing is that Western media coverage was a little bit nicer to Yeltsin because he was the darling of the West than the second Chechen war when, the Russians were evil and bad. Now, of course, both wars were awful because this was mostly urban warfare, right? So in urban warfare, you're going to have suffering that involves civilians. And there were multiple awful acts of terrorism involving capture of a hospital in 1995, where, the death toll was probably about a quarter of the hostages, right? Schools, like it was just not like they were fighting the Russian police or something like that, the federal forces, which happened too. And there were many terrorist acts that involved the Again, it's like if they're described as the government forces, it makes me think of like the Assad government forces in Syria. It's just kind of amazing how that's being described too, many, many years later. But there were acts of terrorism pertaining, targeting just absolutely innocent civilians, like, sick people in a hospital and children, right, in a school, just really, really awful things. So that's another feature here. So out of this sort of mishmash of different movements and ideologies and ways of thinking comes someone like Navalny, right? So it's one of the reasons, these acts of terrorism, this is one of the reasons why there was a certain level of anti-Muslim, sentiment in certain parts of Russia. Now, of course, it's unfair to, to us, it's obvious that it's unfair to think of an entire large religious group judging them by the acts of a small group of extremists that, the larger group is not practicing these beliefs. But nonetheless, it's something we've seen, right? We've seen in the US since 9/11, et cetera. So it's just, it's just an unfortunate thing that happens, and it requires education, et cetera, et cetera. But regardless, Navalny, in that sense, in his sentiment, was not alone. He was not the only person that would make statements like "stop feeding the Caucasus," right? And again, when he would say "stop feeding the Caucasus," other people would say this too. And this was about the amount of money that was going to the Caucasus, right? To the Chechen War. The Second Chechen War, right, was fought under Putin. And also just the funding that was going on to later the revival of Chechnya and, the other republics in the North Caucasus, et cetera, et cetera. So there was definitely this xenophobic, not so much an undercurrent. It was very much in public amongst certain parts of the population. It was sort of colored by these awful acts of terrorism. And unfortunately, this was the perception in some parts of the Russian community. So he was sort of not alone in that sense. But to me, the interesting thing is that none of that, I mean, he has made some statements that by today's Western standards, like, comparing people to cockroaches is a little bit outrageous, to say the least. This isn't...
Kind of remind me of the penis piano player, comparing the Turks with cockroaches.
Yes, well, he's made many comparisons, I think, since...
Wait, I lost your image. Okay, you're back. Sorry.
Yeah, we can definitely talk about the instrumentalization of these kind of more extreme undercurrents by the official West, which subscribe to kind of this happy kittens and puppies and human rights ideology. But of course, human rights only applies to a select group of people, not everyone. So we can definitely talk about the Ukrainian situation and someone like Navalny. But that part of his biography is not really in Western media. Here and there, you can find pieces, like I said, something like The Salon, maybe in a couple of other publications, but definitely it's completely left out. So then you have a couple of questions. First of all, if you are a foreign intelligence agency, is there really no one better than this guy? Can't you find someone with a little bit of a cleaner biography, a little bit more clean cut to use as your project for trying to push for a color revolution? So that's interesting, right? Why are you going for this guy? Second of all, when you, again, go into this Russian Wikipedia, that part is pretty much absent on it. But it talks about his other pursuits in that same time period, so sort of the mid 2000s to about 2010. And it talks about all of his involvement in all of these sort of liberal-ish parties, pro-Western liberals, kind of minority parties, like there's, this party that was called the Apple Party, right? Yabloko, et cetera, et cetera. There's a long list. So he was doing all of these things, but his involvement in kind of more, extreme nationalist events like the Russian March is just not there. So it's definitely giving you more of a skewed perception, but at the same time, it's very interesting how he was simultaneously going after very different ideologies, which to me seems very opportunistic even before he started participating in politics on a broader scale. Like, why are you simultaneously this human rights, rainbows and puppies and kittens liberal and pro-Western liberal, right? And we know what the official ideology is. and sounds good on paper, right? And at the same time, you're going to this anti, Russian march, only ethno-nationalist march, and you're talking, comparing groups of people to cockroaches. It's just very interesting how it all was happening at the same time. And at one point, it wasn't at this time, but it was the last time he was in the news, and I can't remember when this was. I was looking at the social media of some of these other prominent figures in that general movement of these. I don't know. It's hard for me to call them nationalists. Some of them are ethno-nationalists. They're not super extreme. Some of them are more like monarchists, anti-Soviet monarchists. I don't want to name any names, but some of them are sort of prominent figures that are still active. And I wanted to see what they were saying. And I think I actually accidentally came across what they were saying about Navalny. And they said, before his involvement in these sort of color revolutionary scenarios, he was an okay guy, but he was really full of himself. He was really kind of like narcissistic in terms of attention seeking. And to me, again, I know it's anecdotal, it's, a couple of people's perception, but people who knew him personally in the mid 2000s. So I thought it was really interesting because it really aligns with what I would think of a person like this, someone very opportunistic and attention seeking and kind of disregarding perhaps a certain level of danger when he would be involved in that kind of in those types of activities, but also wanting that attention. And if you kind of look at his attempts to get into Russian politics, he was like any means necessary, protest, running for this type of government, working for this guy in Russian politics, trying to become the mayor, trying to become the president. It was all kind of in a short time period. Usually in more kind of Western politics, there's a little bit slower of a trajectory, right, of people sort of rising to power. I mean, there are definitely some exceptions with these European middle managers, right, that we often mention. But it was really interesting to me. That really sort of solidifies my perception of him as being this opportunist for whom access to power was more important than a particular ideology, and he could kind of be this chameleon and change his colors whenever. Well, here I'm going to cater to these people because they don't like all this money going to the Caucasus, right? And they don't like Muslims. But here I'm going to cater to these nice pro-Western liberals, and I'm going to talk about, anti-corruption and human rights. So, and it's going to happen all within kind of the same time period. So it's not the case of like, oh, well, he thought this, he realized he was wrong, or he changed his views, and now he thinks this. That would be more natural, but it wasn't. It was all sort of at the same time. So,
yeah, the thing about this this type of people is that they are ready to whatever. They are not ideological. Maybe they have some hate or some ideology behind them, but then when they get recruited as an asset for whatever. They first they need to be trained, they need to receive money, and so once they start seeing money, that's a different thing, so this guy most of these people probably start things in a sense of ideology, but after the money starts to pump in, ideology goes to the tubes. Poor people have ideology. These rich people have money. It's different. So
go ahead.
This kind of shows up what the guy came for. He having these multifacial attitudes to the current thing. Right, so it's just like
it's
Facebook.
Actually kind of indicative of these democratic politics, where you go to one target audience and you tell them one thing, and then you go to a different target audience and you tell them something different, and you're trying to win all these different parts of the the electorate, right? These smaller groups, which is kind of not very not very honest, but that's a main feature of democracy today.
And at the same time, you need to keep these people pushing in groups that are extremely violent toward the government, like neo mustaches and all this type of people, extremist Islam or whatever. You name here, whatever has been blowing up things in the last 20, 30, 40 years, that's where those guys needs to be. So You see the same with Ukraine. You see the same in Brazil. You saw the same in Brazil during Bolsonaro
Mm,
election,
sure.
and not even just Bolsonaro, because most of people, of course, are not following the Brazilian elections. But back
Right.
at that time, the Labor Party, which is the party of the actual president of Brazil, Lula da Silva. So Lula
Mm-hmm.
was in jail, had been jailed.
Mm-hmm.
Also, it was a kind of a coup d'etat on that. It was not a coup d'etat because he was not the president, but he
Right.
was he was going to run for president against Bolsonaro. So they jailed him. And back then, the Labor Party has always been, they have the star with the hammer and the thing that I forgot the name.
Sickle, hammer and sickle. Yeah.
Sickle, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of communist party or socialist party, stuff
Right.
like that. And during the campaign, they simply rebranded using the colors of Brazil because the nationalist sentiment was flourishing in Brazil at that moment, and that it ended up with Bolsonaro being elected, of course. Uh, uh, but you see, even whoever they just rebrand at any moment, but these people usually rebrand to the current thing, just like
Of course.
Facebook, when people putting Ukraine flags and then
Yes.
Palestine flags, most of them have no idea what's going on, but we have to support the current thing, and that's
Yeah.
where those kind of people capitalize.
Yes, exactly. And yeah, it's interesting because I kind of look at him in 2000s. He was sort of definitely opportunistic, but he was pursuing maybe his own goals to get into power by whatever means necessary. But when he got rebranded with the help of multiple foreign powers, that was definitely more of like, that's why I call him Project Navalny, right? I no longer refer to him by his name because he is now this brand, and a brand had a particular purpose. And we could sort of look at one of the first major events in that rebranding is when he went to the Yale World Fellows Program, which is very interesting. And I'm not sure if this is true. I haven't fully fact checked it, but a bunch of articles say that he was nominated or suggested by that former chess player Kasparov, which is like this massive pro-Western liberal, but also Russophobe. Like he criticized anything and everything but Russia beyond rhyme and reason. I mean, he still does. He actually has had me blocked on Twitter/X for years. And I'm not even sure if I said anything to him, but he's just so he's just so outrageous. So I thought it was really interesting that if true, like I said, I have not fact checked it. You guys could fact check it for yourselves. He was one of the major figures to kind of connect him to connect Navalny to the official West in this regard. So when you go to a program like this, you're obviously receiving more than just sort of academic training, right? I mean, it's the whole idea of World Fellows. It's about soft power and maybe about some more nefarious purposes that you could sort of draw your own conclusions based on that. The interesting thing about the World Fellows thing is that the current Russian head of the central bank, right? I was always kind of skeptical of her because she went through the same institution, and I was a little bit,
Navalny.
yes, exactly. I was a bit, knowing what we know about Navalny, when I realized that she's actually has that same background, I was worried. And I mean, I think in some ways she can be criticized, but what she's done in the last few years, right, essentially balancing the Russian economy, and actually it's doing very, very well from that aspect of the ruling the central bank. I think it's really interesting that I don't think she fulfilled whatever her overlords, right, her mentors, and that, let's not say overlords, her mentors, her academic mentors wanted for her to do. But isn't it interesting having that kind of person in the central bank of a country, like the most important financial institution? Oh my goodness. I know it's not exceptional, but when you kind of see it in the open, you're like, oh, very, very fascinating, right? So,
Well, a very smart person would have some very smart person from its country going outside to learn what the other country thinks about.
yes,
And, well, Putin is KGB, so
right.
it
Yes,
would
no,
be.
but I guess that tells you that not everyone is an opportunist who is hungry for money and power and by any means necessary. And some people are actually professionals doing their job. But I definitely was skeptical of her because of that Navalny link to that program. But it's interesting. So we should also mention a little bit of all these corruption cases that were brought against him. There are at least 3, but there possibly are some other ones. I'm not an expert on the Russian legal system. All of these cases had to do with things like theft of property, fraud, that type of corruption. And whenever it's brought up in the Western media, it's usually mentioned as this. Well, of course, it's political persecution. But there are a couple of interesting things about that. Well, first of all, Navalny, as soon as he graduated from law school, he got involved in various types of businesses. And, in the 90s in Russia, the business world was just madness, right? People could get rich really quick. This is when you had this rise of these oligarchs, also known as billionaires in the West by a nice name, but in Russia they're oligarchs. For some reason they're different somehow, even though it's, the exact same thing.
If they are Western, they are billionaires on the West.
Yes.
If they are Russian, they are oligarchs.
Yeah, if they're Western, they're billionaires and philanthropists. If they're Russian, they're oligarchs. We have to differentiate because it's a different thing. It's kind of like that Russian meme. It's different. We love that meme. Yeah, so it's different. But yeah, so you kind of had this wild west of, just imagine having this capitalist madness of neoliberalism introduced to what used to be a state-controlled centralized economy, right? You're going to have an insane level of criminality going on and corruption in that world. Eventually, Putin, maybe not perfectly, but he cracked down on not just those economic oversights, but also just the power of the oligarchs in politics as well. But basically, of course, Navalny was sort of youngish when he was, in the 90s. I think he was born, let me check, 1976 or something like that. But in the 2000s, he was definitely operating and launching all these businesses, sometimes working with family members. So he was definitely in that world. And so I would actually not be surprised. I haven't investigated these corruption cases in detail, but that something may have been going on because other people were doing things that were illegal, right? In this sort of sketchy gray area period. So, and I was looking at the first charges of corruption where he actually received a criminal sentence, and then the sentence was commuted to I'm sort of glitching on my English, when you don't have to go to jail for it. Like you have that sentence, but it's basically
parole or something like that.
Not parole. It's like when you don't have to go to jail at all. So it's like you have that sentence, but I'm 4 hours of sleep, right?
You pay a fine or something like that.
No. You still have that jail sentence, but you never are actually in jail. It'll come to me after the show, and it'll be like, oh my god, I watch so much true crime when I clean the house, and I totally forgot what
the word on the description.
But anyways, his sentence was basically commuted to not having to be in prison at all, which is also kind of interesting because it happened after some of those massive protests in Russia. So then the question is, if he was such a threat, why is this Russian court that is supposedly controlled by Putin single-handedly pressing buttons? Why is it releasing him into the wild to do all this stuff, right? Again, it doesn't quite match up. And I know that Navalny and his lawyers made multiple complaints to I think it was the European Court of Human Rights. And I think the first complaint basically concluded that, I think it was something like his human rights were violated, but there is no political basis. Like he was not persecuted politically. I think it changed with like the next corruption cases, but the initial case did not conclude that it was political, which I think is very interesting. When you start looking at those details, it's much more nuanced than the picture that is presented in the West. Now, is it possible that he was if these cases were pursued more rigorously than cases against other people that were engaged in other types of criminal activities when it comes to business? It's possible, but is it done to sort of like out of fear that this man is just going to come and rule Russia? I don't think so, because again, he's never really, other than that Moscow election that he lost, right? He did place well. He never really had broad support in Russia. It was very, very specific. So, that's definitely very, very noteworthy. You're not going to find that specificity in the Western media.
Plus, he just left Russia, and he was told not to come back. Well, maybe that's the word you're looking for. No, when you are
So what? I'm just
like in
this is
asylum
so
or
sad.
something like that.
Okay, it says a suspended sentence, but I think there is a better word than a suspended sentence, is what I was talking about. Basically, it's like an alternative to imprisoning someone.
Okay, but in any case, he was not living in Russia, and then he was convicted, and he
Well,
was going
he
to be
did.
jailed.
Mhm.
Right.
He
Yeah.
did participate, right, in those massive protests in 2012 ish, and that's another thing that I feel like those were definitely major events. It was an attempt at a color revolution in Russia. If you look at the way it was being described, they were trying to call it the snow revolution, right? So we had the rose revolution in Georgia, we had 2003, we had the orange revolution in Ukraine, right, the first one before the Maidan in 2004. And so now these 2011, 2012, sort of going into 2013, they were trying to really, really, really hard to brand it as the snow revolution in Russia, and it failed. And wasn't the Hong Kong one, wasn't it like the umbrella?
Jasmine, the Jasmine Revolution, if I'm not mistaken, or that was
Which
Taiwan.
one was the umbrella
There
revolution?
was
What
the
was going
umbrella.
to?
Well, yeah, I just
Yes,
had
it
this
was
with
the
Angela the
20.
other day.
Yes, the 2014 Hong Kong protests were called the umbrella movement. So yeah, there's always this sexy word that they're trying to use, the powers that be to brand this thing, so then they can use it in all the media and everyone will know what is being referred to. So it was definitely a serious situation, and I would say there are sort of multiple factors in play. Remember 2008, going into 2009, there was a major, major economic downturn because of the banking crisis on Wall Street. It was more major in the US, I would say, than maybe in Canada, but lots and lots of people lost their jobs. Of course, the US being the economic hegemon in the world, that crisis impacted other countries, obviously, right? Because the dollar is the reserve currency. The US at this time was the one economic giant. Now we have China. So there was also an economic downturn in Russia. So definitely people were sort of not very happy with the situation there from that perspective, or some people were not satisfied with the socioeconomics from that perspective. You also had, it was actually that late that the Second Chechen War wrapped up, right? So you had this decade where things were sort of cooling down in terms of not just the fighting in the North Caucasus, but also just the sheer number of acts of terrorism, but they were not completely absent. So you kind of had this, 1994-ish to 2009, a long period of not just war, but also multiple acts of terrorism. And so you're always living in this heightened sense of, well, maybe not everyone, but some people in this heightened sense of alertness, right? And I even remember back then, people were like, are you sure you want to travel to visit family? Because you can be blown up on the subway, right? So there was definitely that sentiment, like, where you careful walking around downtown, whatever, Moscow, St. Petersburg, because they could just, there could be an act of terrorism there. So there was definitely that awareness, right? So there was also that feature too. And yes, there was also this dissatisfaction with certain local, sort of more regional authorities. Obviously, in a large country like Russia, not every single governor, mayor, business owner is going to be this absolute paragon of virtue, right? There definitely are going to be some cases of corruption, just like anywhere else. So, when you live somewhere, right, you are going to pay attention to those local problems, right? So it's natural for you to want to change those. So, if I am a Russian living in the West, I'm going to be paying attention to my immediate ice that hasn't been cleaned up, and I don't want to fall down. It could be something as trivial as that. It could be something more significant, like, the taxes are not being spent properly on, municipal services, whatever, just very natural. So there was also that. So there was that sentiment of corruption. And of course, you had foreign, NGOs that were still very much active in Russia, really, really, really playing it up. So that was sort of like the background for those protests in large cities, essentially. And usually there are multiple reasons, right, for such protests, but it was definitely a serious attempt to carry out a color revolution. Like I said, they even picked a name; it just didn't go through. And Navalny was definitely involved in that in a serious way. And yes, he's been doing a lot of sort of in the 2010 to 2020. He's been doing a lot of traveling between the official West. We all saw the clip of one of his major, right hand men meeting with an agent with an agency, a certain agency, two-letter, one-number agency from the a certain country that we can call it Albion, right? And this person is this was not Navalny himself, but it was someone closely linked to him, right? He was asking for a lot of funding for such. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was very interesting because it was this kind of outrage from the mass media that it's circulating this video accusing Navalny, but it's not Navalny.
It's just his right hand man or one of his operatives, right? Someone linked to one of his organizations, right? So it's almost like, do you really need to be that specific? And sometimes that's how people like to debunk things,
Yeah.
Anyway.
But if is the Panama Papers, someone that is that had dinner once with the cousin of someone that works for the Putin,
the cousin of the ex-husband of the second wife.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very serious. Yes, it's very serious. So that's really interesting. And then, of course, he tried to participate in the 2018 election, in the presidential election in Russia. That's the one, right, we referred to previously with the Skripal poisoning, right, the the ex-spy, I guess, who lived in London, right, of all places. This is where you decide to go. Do you think good things are going to happen to you there? Probably not. So, yeah, it's pretty interesting. But, I mean, the very fact that he came back to a country where he was, despite his criminal record, he was allowed to participate in these elections, I think that also says something about the Russian government. Why didn't they just, not allow him to do that? Why didn't they shut him down?
Here.
Yeah.
At that moment.
It's almost like, what is this? This doesn't quite fit that narrative, right? It's a much, much, much more nuanced. And in those elections, again, whereas he did well in that 2013 Moscow election, he did not. His support was really just minuscule, just not anyone that would be taken seriously. Again, it was these hipsterish, urban, younger people. It's actually kind of frustrating to me where I mean, you can kind of say, to what extent is he responsible to luring all these thousands of young people into participating in these sketchy protests and stuff like that? I mean, I guess it's kind of an open question. You could say he is the leader. He should be aware of where he's dragging these young people that may or may not ruin their lives, right? Because some of them love taking selfies as they're being arrested because they try to kick a cop or something like that. Yeah. But I think there is some responsibility there too, because some Russians that are much more harsh than I am, they would claim, that he ruined the lives of thousands of young people that were involved in that protest movement, who could have been benefiting the country in other ways, even if they were addressing certain problems, right, that exactly. Russia has, right? So definitely some blame is there. And that's definitely a sentiment that's quite common, amongst the average Russian population. And then, of course, there was that underwear Novichok, right? Novichok has been, now that it's been tested out on the Skripal family, on Skripal and his daughter, it's been revived as this battle agent. And it was, he supposedly was poisoned and it was in his underwear. It's just like... It's just the perfect tabloid headline, right? Like, of course, people are going to click on.
Now
Yeah, it's going to be. Yeah, it's just like, who comes up with it?
What's the name of that in English for kids? The medicine that you put on the back of the kid, on the butt of the kid.
Oh, like a diaper rash. Yeah, like just a lotion for diaper rash. Yeah.
Yeah, something like that. I was going to say that medicine that you introduce in the children when they have some intestine issues,
I see, I
and
see. Okay. Yeah. Well,
so
to me, it's just
Novichok
like,
now in that.
yeah, it's just like the perfect tabloid headline, right? It's now that they've introduced this idea of Novichok, and I think previously I did a little bit of an investigation that there are even these TV shows coming out before the Skripal situation where they talk about similar sort of this predictive programming. Yeah, we could kind of go down that rabbit hole at some point. I know other people have done that, but it's not ultimately the most important point here. But yeah, it was just this perfect made for tabloids headline. And again, evil, Russian government that could have just, squashed this mosquito, Navalny, that was annoying them. They allowed him to go
Years
to Germany.
ago.
Right. They
Yeah,
allowed
yeah.
him to go to Germany, which is to me, again, is like, how does that fit your narrative of this evil authoritarian tyrant when you're essentially letting him go to undergo medical treatment? And how he was really hurt and what he was sick with is definitely an interesting question because we always say that these people, especially when they're not very successful politically, they become more relevant as a martyr, as a sacrificial lamb,
Exactly.
than for media publicity, for getting money for certain political pursuits in other countries. And in his case, that was definitely there. This is my opinion. So he goes to Germany, and the interesting thing is that he's in Germany between August in 2020, January 2021. And if you remember, this was the time when there was a certain illness going around the world, and they introduced a certain miracle cure for that illness. So we know that he was in supposedly that cure was introduced to him, right? Multiple times. And we now know that, according to multiple sources, right, that there are some medical links between having blood clots, right, and that particular miracle cure. So there's definitely that undercurrent of people, team tinfoil hat, thinking of how could he have died, right? The most recent event
Uh,
in this saga, right? So we can take
that,
sort of the, pardon?
no, but that's just conspiracy theory. The Daily Beast cracked the case. I don't know if you
Of
read
course,
it.
they cracked it before he even died. They had it ready
Oh
to
yeah,
go.
but it was the secret KGB punch.
Yeah. Oh,
Like
yeah. I
Kill
saw the
Bill
KGB punch.
5 point palm.
Yeah, like I said, they're making Putin sound a lot cooler than he actually is. He's trying to get to that 99% rating from his whatever 80 or 78% that he's at now. Yeah, he's definitely trying to get higher up there in the love of the people by introducing the secret KGB judo battle punch or whatever it was, right? So yeah, it's kind of remarkable that this would even be published seriously. But I guess the more outrageous the headline, the more people would read it and believe it. Perhaps a certain segment of the population might believe it with all the other sort of disinformation propaganda that has been introduced as well. But
Mhm.
yeah, I mean, I feel like I don't know if it's worth analyzing why he may or may not have passed away, right? He was in his late 40s, but he was also in prison and he went on a hunger strike, right? So if you're in a prison in a very cold place, I mean, the prison is not the nicest place to be. At the same time, I think they sometimes exaggerate prisons because they're definitely not like Scandinavian prisons where people like, a certain mass shooter can watch TV and play sports and do all this other fun stuff. But there are other prisons in the U.S. that has much, much, much harsher sentences for smaller crimes. So I think that stereotype of the Russian prison is like, in some cases, maybe a certain labor prison might be, when it comes to normal prisoners, might apply. But at the same time, should prison really be this nice place, like in Scandinavia, like in Norway, where they just kind of chill and taxpayers, pay for their nice little vacation away from the world?
Five-star
Probably
hotel.
not. But yeah, so he is in this prison. I'm not sure the extent to which how harsh life was or wasn't. I'm sure he had special attention because of all that publicity in the West. But yeah, he went on a hunger strike, and obviously, if you're going in a hunger strike, you're gonna really damage your health, right? That's not a very nice thing. So the most sort of non-conspiracy theory explanation here would be he really he really did detrimental things to his health, right? More conspiratorial theories would have to do with where a blood clot, if that's what happened, would have come from, right? And then we can go down to the timing, right? That it's just a month before the Russian election. Isn't it interesting that Putin is riding the wave of popularity, not just in Russia. He had this interview that reached 1 billion views, which is really unheard of for any politician. Even, most celebrities and musicians don't get that many views. There are only a few examples of that, right? So the timing is definitely very interesting. People can draw their own conclusions about that. But yeah, I think it's worth kind of looking at the entire trajectory of this man and to go back to his ideology, whether he was an opportunist or he really believed what he was saying in the 2000s, it's that instrumentalization, right, by the West, where they don't really, they might not even care, or they might be using, like they would be using the sort of extreme nationalists in Ukraine, right, to sort of put their boot down and sort of use street justice, quote unquote, right, to crack down on anyone that would disagree with what's been going on in Ukraine since 2014, whether it's the so-called moderate rebels, right, that would be receiving funding from foreign countries, or whether it's someone like Navalny, right? So there is definitely that instrumentalization, and I think that says a lot about the ideology of liberalism, where on the surface it's, we're about human rights, we're about egalitarianism, we're about all kinds of equality, we're about democracy, freedom, blah, 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 rainbows, kittens, puppies, and all the happy things, gumdrops. But then at the same time, for our little dirty deeds elsewhere, we can be using these more extreme elements. And in some cases, we can sort of whitewash them and dress them nicely. Or we're going to pick a guy that looks like the young Yeltsin for the, the Russian situation. In other cases, we're not even going to bother whitewashing them. We're just going to call them moderate rebels because, they're these freedom fighters. So we don't even have to dress them nicely. And, in the Ukrainian case, we're just going to call them as, people seeking their liberation from hundreds of centuries, millions of years of Russian oppression, right? So it's very interesting that instrumentalization of other ideologies that in theory would challenge liberalism, but because they're not challenging liberalism on a global scale, these liberal governments do find them useful for their own purposes. It's very sociopathic, again, in my opinion, to do that sort of thing.
That's why more or less those things never work out the way they want, because at some point these people just say, okay, screw you, I'm going to listen to this guy now because we have nothing in common. The thing is that at the same point, at the same time, the Western oligarchy, it's very well connected. The values, all the values, they are very well connected with such and such ideology, if you pay attention for a minute. And yeah, that's what we are discussing just before. These guys are very easily extremists, extreme thoughts are very easily to be brought up or to boil on society. As you said, of course, you need you have the manual of the color revolution.
You have fertile soil for it. Yeah.
Exactly, a fertile soil. You need some crisis. Nobody cares if something happened in the United States.
If there's no crisis, you can engineer a crisis.
You can engineer a crisis. You can, for example, the as you mentioned, the 2008 USA economic crisis.
Banking crisis. Yeah, banking crash.
Banking crisis. It didn't went that far in Brazil. Brazil did not suffer that much of that. At that moment we had a very interesting, quite solid economy back at that moment. But then, of course, a couple of years later, it reached us. Right. No, but it was not immediate. Plus, that was the big thing. I don't know if you remember the oil drop because of the the crudes from the United States. Yeah. Well, that was the excuse, but the oil drop price to like $30, which was something that was aimed to hurt Russia. But actually destroyed Brazilian economy because Brazil oil exploration is on deep sea, and deep sea oil exploration is very, very expensive. It's much more expensive than make a hole on the ground and
just drill.
black
Yeah.
water goes out. So that mostly broke the Brazilian economy, and that made a very fertile soil for the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff, who was the successor of Lula da Silva at that time,
Yeah.
and then the rise of figures like Bolsonaro, and others, among others. Okay,
Yeah.
and what we were discussing before. This exactly this rebranding of Navalny around 2010s, more or less around the same time. Some political parties were born in Brazil, and very sketchy political
Right.
parties. They are not very relevant yet, at least not to the presidential level, but they made a lot of space in state level, city level. What's it called? The chamber, the deputy chamber in Brazil. We have the deputy chamber. Ministerial and stuff like that, but and very interesting subjects also there. We have that would be more to discuss with someone from Brazil, and I'm going to point this video, and
So they
someday
can
we
sort
are
of
going
check
to
it
have
out.
a full week summit of color revolution around the 2010s, and I
Yeah.
need
And I
to.
guess the question is, right, it's whether these things are completely engineered in terms of the crisis or whether they happen because of some mismanagement, right? Bankers are not exactly known as to be the most responsible people, right? There's definitely, if in the 2008 and in the aftermath, people really talked about the bonuses that, like some managing director at some bank was getting, how outrageous that was compared to both other lower sort of underlings in the bank, but also in the general population. So, you could say maybe it was just this mismanagement within the banks, mismanagement within the system of capitalism. You can kind of have different theories about that. But then you could say, this thing happened and it was useful for the powers that be to exploit it and to exploit the political situations in countries, ABC, and change that internal dynamic to make it more beneficial to, access Russian natural resources, for example. So it's definitely, you can kind of go both ways on that question, the extent to which these things are engineered, but I think ultimately it doesn't matter because people end up exploiting them, like people in power, right, end up exploiting them to their own benefit, to the best of their ability. And it's definitely something to pay attention to.
Yeah, exactly. And so a little bit of trivia from what I get from our fantastic source, Wikipedia. Uh, so the Sergei and Yulia Skripal poisoning. So first of all, that was a very interesting point that Alex Christoforou raised this week, which is that this Novichok, it's extremely deadly, and all these people
And nothing really,
survived.
nothing happened to them. Yeah, I know. They just kind of ended up in a hospital. It's just, that's always been, I mean, it was the point that was raised when it first came out. And I think people forget because you read about it and it's supposed to be this, battle agent that's supposed to be this awful chemical that was produced, as a chemical weapon. But then in all the cases, whether it's the Novichok in underwear or Novichok on a bench in somewhere in England, none of them really got hurt seriously. It's just kind of remarkable how that works, right? So
Yeah, the Russians are incompetent on
I
doing
know,
chemical.
exactly. It's like at the same time they are controlling the world and all these governments around the world, and then at the same time they can't properly kill the opponents in in Russia or in London, right? All roads lead to London.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I'm just making a joke.
Most likely Navalny, as according to our chick named dude Lindsey Graham. So this guy stood a long time in prison until getting murdered, right? So they are really incompetent. The Russians are really incompetent on killing people.
They
Let's
let
put
him
like
go to
that.
Germany. They let him, right? They sort of dropped the criminal charges. They commuted his sentence, right? They made it
Yeah,
into a reduced
they
sentence.
really want to do it, but they are just
They just
not good
can't.
at
Yeah,
doing
they
it.
just can't. They
Yeah.
just don't have until finally Putin worked himself up to do the KGB battle punch, right? And and now his popularity is going back up, right? Not in the West, where he was.
I don't know. I don't know. Maybe not among the Western oligarchs,
Well,
but
it certainly distracted from the billion views, right? Billion plus views on his recent interview. That was definitely a distraction. So that was an interesting coincidence, but it's just a coincidence,
yeah,
like
just another
like lots of other
coincidence that
coincidences.
yeah, the Avdiivka falls on the same day,
Yes.
and just a coincidence that Navalny's wife was in Germany, and by chance she just tripped and fell inside the security assembly of Munich, and a lot of coincidences, and by coincidence next month there's the elections on Russia.
Again, just a complete coincidence. No one knew there was an election coming up. It just happened, right? It's just been announced. So
Exactly. Just like the Skripals that were kind of tried to
just
be killed in the
but
4th
didn't, yeah,
March.
chilling on the bench. Yeah, they didn't get to their
Feeling
underwear. Didn't get to the
exactly.
underwear. Yeah.
And in the elections were on 18th of March, right? If I put yeah, 18th of
Yeah,
March
usually
of the
they're like
same
in
year.
in spring. Yeah, usually they're in spring of whatever the year is.
Plus, that was a combo because it was the Yulia and Sergei, so it was a couple. It was a combo because also in June, and that also Alex Cristoforo once in a video he pointed out always when there is some big event, and in June of 2018 it was the Moscow World Cup,
Yes.
a
Yes.
huge global
Yeah, well,
event.
much like the 2014 Sochi Olympics happened at the same time as the Maidan escalated to violence, right? And
Hmm.
the 2008 Beijing Olympics and the Russia-Georgia war that was then concluded to have been started by the Georgian then president Saakashvili. Yeah, there's always some major international event, and when it happens in Russia, it's especially problematic, right? Because then there has to be some negative publicity, but that's all a coincidence.
Which, by the way, we're going to talk about Georgia in a 2 weeks time,
Yes.
just so you guys keep tuned. And so just some data from that election on 2018 election. So the Putin
The
won with
Putin.
77% as independent. That's interesting. I don't know, is this the name of the party, or he just run as the Putin and
I mean, he's officially part of United Russia. So I can't
okay.
remember honestly. I'd have to go back and check whether he was sort of leaving and coming back to the party. But the dominant party is the United Russia Party in
Okay.
Russia. So
And in second place was the Communist Party with 8%.
which is, this is like the official opposition, but it never gets mentioned as the official opposition, which is really interesting to
Yeah.
me for many reasons. Because on the one hand, you have all these sort of conservatives that say Russia is still communist. Well, it's like, well, here is an active communist party. Now, there are many differences between the modern communist parties, such as religion, their active participation in orthodoxy. But nonetheless, it's sort of like, well, there's this party, but then somehow it's never really mentioned as an opposition party in Russia. Now, of course, there are some issues on which the Communist Party and United Russia align, because neither one of those parties is a pro-Western party. So it's not surprising that you can have opposition, believe it or not, that is not facing towards the West. And I know it's really shocking to Kremlinologists all around the world to realize that you can have opposition that is not interested in you. They're interested in domestic issues. They're interested in, sort of staying within the country and improving it according to their specific program, right, specific ideology. But yeah, I know this is probably why they never mention it, because to them, opposition equals pro-Western. Like there's no other opposition that can exist. So like, let's say when I criticize Putin, I criticize him for being insufficiently harsh, but I would never be mentioned. I would always be mentioned as a Putin shill instead of an occasional critic of Putin, because I'm not criticizing him from a Western liberal perspective. I'm criticizing him from sort of a more hardcore, maybe a little bit more socialist on in some categories, obviously economically, and so on and so forth. So people like me who would, understandably sort of support his ideas in some ways, but also criticize his ideas in other ways, would never be thought of as like, oh, well, she's criticizing him. But she's not criticizing him from our perspective, therefore she's irrelevant, right? So
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
very interesting, and I'm just like I'm some chick on the internet, right? Talking to you through a stream, and here we have a party that does gain significant popular support, right? Like this is actually important, and so
Mhm.
why are these people never mentioned as a serious political force when they are? And this is kind of usually how they place, somewhere between like 8 to 15%, maybe even higher, which is kind of significant for a political party in a country that has multiple parties, right? So
Yeah. And so this is a question that I have. So the third place was the Liberal Democratic Party with 5%. And what
which
I
is
found,
another, I would say, opposition party, right? Zhirinovsky, who recently passed away, we all miss him because he's sort of been portrayed as this clown, and he definitely had this clownish persona because sometimes he would make these outrageous statements. But when he made more serious political commentary, people now go back to his videos from 10, 15 years ago, and they say, oh my God, he predicted this thing. He predicted the war in Ukraine 15 years ago, or not even, like in the 90s. He predicted this other thing to the date. And so people kind of almost see him as this, well, kind of half jokingly as a prophet. But he was definitely very smart, even though he had this really outrageous clownish persona. And sometimes he would say outrageous things in public, but this is how he attracted attention. So that was his party. And then this party is still functional. I mean, it has other leaders. It's still a major party. And I would consider it an opposition party too.
what I found interesting also, to my complete ignorance about Russia, and that was my question, is that the colors of the party are the yellow blue, like
Because it's,
just like the Ukrainian flag. So what I wanted to ask about this is what does this colors or this color composition means for Russia or at all?
I'm not going to pretend like I know why they used yellow blue. So I know sometimes blue alone, blue and white, is used in different contexts. So for instance, in the Russian
But it's
Navy.
okay.
But yeah, but I've
It's the
never
flag of
seen.
Russia.
Yeah, no, it's just the blue and the white would be
No,
used.
okay,
No,
but
no
they
red.
are part of the flag of Russia.
But so now I'm just going to Google this because, oh, that's very interesting. You know,
Because the Brazilian soccer team, the T-shirt can be the yellow with what's it called, the symbol of the team, or it can be the blue and white. And blue and white in our flag is a minor part. The flag is
right.
mostly green and yellow. So the Brazil is known by green and yellow. It's
Right.
more green and yellow, but
Yeah.
we also have white and blue, but it can be used, and it's all right for Brazilian perspective. We do not consider that,
Well,
although
I would
that's
say, again, I don't know why they're using these colors. The logo says freedom, patriotism, and law. I know that Zhirinovsky specifically had been critical of the Soviet Union, but at the same time, he's been very sort of patriotic, and he would oppose sort of capitalism, right? Even though it's called liberal democratic, he would also oppose the return of communism. But the colors, I mean, I would just make a guess. This is an educated guess that I would not be surprised that an agrarian country like Russia, right, would be using the blue sky and a yellow for the land, right? That is, yeah, but maybe that's not true. But I mean, I think in the case of Ukraine, it's not, I mean, obviously it's their national flag, but I don't know if that's, exclusively right their idea of using the blue sky and then like the wheat field being yellow, right? So possibly, but I think that's kind of more of a minor thing. But I would definitely consider LDPR to be another opposition party that is sort of a major party. I know 5% might not sound high, but Russia does have many parties, and it's definitely a party that would disagree with the ruling party on some important issues, but at the same time, because they are sort of more anti-capitalist in some ways, and they're not sharing pro-Western perspectives, they're also not being mentioned as a major opposition party because it doesn't fit the narrative of the 2%ers representing. Like I said, the Russian, I don't think I mentioned this, the Russian Wikipedia described Navalny, citing the New York Times, of course, because that's what every average Russian reads in English. They go to the New York Times as the key opposition figure to Putin. Like there's no one else. So yeah, it's really kind of fascinating how a much more nuanced political environment, a political landscape in Russia is just being dumbed down to Putin versus some pro-Western liberal
Navalny.
guy, but then that pro-Western liberal guy has very, very, very little support. So yeah, it's kind of interesting, to say the
Yeah.
least.
So, just as another trivia, as we were talking about the Skripal case, there was also in 2006 the Alexander Litvinenko.
Litvinenko, yeah.
Litvinenko, and by chance he also died he was also poisoned. Well, he was poisoned with polonium, if I'm not mistaken. But
I don't know
also
what
in
it is about the
the
UK.
UK.
What is it about the UK? It's just like something happens. As soon as someone goes to the UK, something happens to them there, but it's always the Russians' fault. Um,
Yeah,
yeah. So yeah, there's definitely. I think that initial case has been used for media attention too. Then linking it to the super duper battle agent
La-
Novichok that never seems to actually do his
laboratory.
job. Right. Exactly. So yeah, there's definitely that idea. It kind of just blows my mind that people are not thinking of like, well, they're both in London, they're in the UK. Isn't there a little bit of a connection there? I mean, some people have conspiracy theories about some of these oligarchs, right, that fled Russia, and one of them ended up hanging himself, and I think he hanged himself. But again, his death was, some people think his death was kind of sketchy because he was trying to apologize to Putin and come back to Russia. And then all of a sudden he dies. So again, draw your own conclusions. If you want to put on a tinfoil hat, do so. But that's sort of another thing that it wasn't like a poisoning, so it didn't, it's not being mentioned constantly. But it's definitely something that some people consider a little bit sketchy with the London connection. But of course, we love the UK. No, we don't. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, some people say all roads lead to London. Again, draw your own conclusions. I'm not sure if that's the case, but it's definitely that all of these coincidences that happen in London, and it's kind of hard to ignore them. So it just kind of blows my mind that people just overlook like it's normal. It's normal for all these poisonings to be happening there and making the tabloid headlines. So.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I have to disagree that all roads bring to London. It's an island, so.
Very true. Very true. It's not geographically feasible. Yeah. So
Exactly. So I guess we have run for about 1 hour 15 minutes. I think we have covered a lot of land in this
yeah,
arguments.
I was thinking of discussing his wife, but I feel like there's definitely all these attempts to rebrand her into this grieving widow, and the reality and what she's being branded as are two very, very, very different things. And this information is very easy to access. I know much of it is on Russian social media, so Westerners may not have seen it. But I'm hoping that this attempt falls flat because the news cycle is eventually going to run out, and in my opinion, she's not going to be useful, and hopefully in the best case scenario, she will be just forgotten, right? But who knows? There's definitely been this attempt to really push her very hard, and it's just, to me, it's kind of shocking the difference between someone like Assange's wife, right, Stella, who's been very, very publicly dedicated, and then this, in my opinion, Yulia Navalny is a merry widow. That's my opinion. You are welcome to have your own opinion, but her lifestyle is far, far, far different from someone like Stella Assange. And of course, she's not really mentioned in the mainstream Western media. She's mostly mentioned in kind of human rights circles as well. So that contrast is very, very, very stark to me. But yeah, I just think it's kind of amazing that these attempts to push her very hard as this new figure, this new face of opposition Russia, someone that in my opinion, is also very opportunistic, much like her late husband. I think they're going to fail. So, but yeah, I think we can wrap it up here. This was a long discussion of lots of coincidences. Basically, we should just call it the coincidence show.
The coincidence show.
Yes.
I just have an observation because all this, the Putin with the Tucker Carlson interview. It was very interesting how Putin sent subliminary messages to the West, like, oh hey, yeah, the brain power and all that, the mind power, and no, but it's true. Like guys, we can give you a Hail Mary if you're willing. We can give you a not loss. Not a victory. We are unable to do that, but
Mhm.
we can make your loss very, very
I
easy
think he
for
was
you.
very explicit, and he's been explicit before, but obviously he had a much broader audience here where he was very explicit, like, we're ready to talk. And I think he's been
We're
saying that
ready
for a
to
long time.
talk.
We're ready to talk.
We're
Not
ready to
Ukrainians, but
talk
the people who are, the powers that
in
be. We're
charge.
ready. Yeah, the people
Not
in charge.
Biden. He also made very
We're yeah,
clear that not Biden, the people in charge.
we're
So
ready to
we're
talk.
ready to talk. We're ready to go back on doing business if you're willing to. It's your choice, not ours. But compared to this, you have this week you have the Navalny widow going on the Munich security conference, and just basically telling Putin that it's his fault and he's going to pay for it. It's, threatening the guy,
Which you kind
threatening
of
the guy,
gotta
and
wonder
of course
how.
that she's not the one behind the script. She's not the one that wrote that. She's not the one that
Which
saying
kind
that.
of is very interesting because imagine the position that someone like that would be in. Like, there's clearly something about her that is, has been obtained by the powers that be, where she's making these really, really outrageous, really blunt statements, and I don't think she has, the way back, right? She's kind of like up against a wall. Like, now she's been selected as this one opposition figure because she's had all this publicity. Her Twitter went from not registering to, like, I don't know what it's at now, like 300,000 or X in a couple of days because of all this publicity. So there's definitely that exploitation of social media as well. But yeah, it's almost like when you're making such statements, there's really no going back. And then at some point you have to realize, like much like Zelensky, you can't really escape. You kind of have to play this role. And what happens when you're no longer useful, right? What happens when
Oh,
you're no longer going to be exploited, right? So it's definitely a precarious position to be in. And I'm not sure if these opportunists fully understand that all the whining and dining and being showered with money and having their children sent to Ivy League universities is an infinite, infinite cornucopia that's going to always be there because at any given moment it could just be shut off. But this is the position they chose to be in. So ultimately,
yeah. I think she'll
whether
be
it's
fine.
opportunity or being naive, it's kind of hard to say. But yeah.
Yeah, I think she'll be fine as far as she stays away from London.
Yeah, no more trips, no shopping trips to what's the famous store in London? What is it?
Macy's? No,
No, Macy's
that's
is the
United
U.S. Like, what
States.
is it? Harold? What is it?
I don't know.
Yeah, I was just like,
I
I'm not
don't
even gonna bother googling
stay
it. But
away
yeah,
from fish and chips. So
stay away from underwear laden with Novichok. Stay away from fish and chips. Stay away from benches in random parts of the UK while having a coffee. You might just be sprayed with this battle agent. And yeah, that would be a very safe suggestion. But yes, we're obviously joking. We hope that everyone is happy and safe. And much like, like I think if you ever watch true crime, half of these true crimers say, stay safe. So we want to say, stay safe, stay away from London.
stay
Joking.
away from London.
Stay away from London. Yep, and joking,
Yeah.
but maybe
So
not.
I,
Mhm.
I
I
guess
would
that's
love
it.
to hear if you guys are still tuned in. I would love to hear some of your theories about in the comments about some of the things we've discussed today, because I know it's a hot topic, but it's also something that's been sort of going on in and out of publicity, right, for more than a decade. So I think people definitely have opinions on this. So it'd be interesting because I do go read them. I can't always reply. Sometimes I get bombarded with opinions on Twitter/X. I can't always reply, but I definitely read them. So definitely I'm interested to see what you guys think.
Exactly. So place a comment if you're on the IDM, place a comment on IDM and follow Nina. If you're on Nina, place a comment on Nina and follow the IDM.
Don't place
And
a comment on me. Place a comment. I'm sort of trying not to have comments on me
on exactly.
on my
Yellow
socials.
post-its. Yellow postist.
I know,
Post-its.
they're just like freedom, democracy, revolution. Yeah, don't post any comments directly on me, but on my socials, yeah, you're welcome to. I do read them. And
That's
I'm
a good
actually,
idea for
I am
Balenciaga.
curious. I know for Balenciaga. No, I'm curious because sometimes people come up with theories that I never think of, right? And then you're like, I'm going to start Googling this rabbit hole that they mentioned. I'm going to go in the Russian search engines so that I'm not having any censorship, and I'm going to see what I can find. And sometimes people have some really interesting ideas that I haven't thought of, and I'm sure that happens to a lot of us too. Okay, thank you
Exactly.
for watching. We'll be back next week. And I hope you enjoyed, and see you very soon.
See
Bye.
you next time, guys. Bye bye.